There's this quote out there. Sometimes the only way to go fast is to slow down. And I mean, come on. Who in this day and age actually has time to do that? Life moves exceptionally fast now, and if you're not keeping up, you're behind. You should have just worked harder, worked longer, always be busy, always be doing something. And if you have any free time, well, you're just not doing enough. Exhausting is an understatement. But it's the world we live in. In fact, it's the mindset that anybody who is somebody seems to glorify. So that must mean it's the best way to live, right? As much as you try to avoid it, this mindset is toxic. It affects everybody. I mean, look at me. Here I am, forced to wait. And that's why I'm out here to begin with. I've got to wait in order to continue a project I started. Forced to be still in a world that never slows down. So in my head, I can't really see what's around me. And because of that, nearly having a panic attack that I'm not doing enough, not being productive enough, left with only my thoughts, and that's the issue. I don't know what to think. But I guess to make sense of it, it's probably easiest to start from the beginning. The world isn't always all sunshine and roses. In fact, a little while ago, it seemed like we were going through a period where the sun wouldn't come out whatsoever. Just rain, and lots of it. And also around that time, I was starting to realize what the next big project for the S4 would be. At this point, the car had come quite a long ways. Really, it was only a couple large projects away from being what I would consider perfect. And one of those big projects, I just couldn't get out of my mind. And this one was a slippery slope to say the least. Now the car itself runs and drives fantastic. It's quick and it handles great, but where it's lacking tremendously is the stopping department. And it's not just rapid stops either. Even when coming to a stop slowly, the pedal has absolutely no feel. And we've already bled the system a couple times. So I guess to fix it, we could always upgrade our brake lines. I don't think that's the only issue though. That's just how they feel from inside the car. When it comes to how the car actually stops, well, not that great either. In fact, quite a bit worse than you would expect for a car as quick as this is. And since we're only planning to give this car more power, I guess we should probably get some more aggressive pads. I mean, they did the trick for the E30, so that's all we'll need, right? I mean, what else could I possibly need to make the car better? Oh yeah, the fitment's bad because the front calipers are too wide. But I guess there are worse things than an excuse to upgrade front calipers. And I mean, with the new calipers, we're gonna need new rotors, so add those to the list too. I guess there is more to this than I initially thought. You know, while I'm looking at the car, if we just upgrade the front, won't the rear look unbalanced? I mean, the rotors on here are already so small you can hardly see them. So at that point, we really need to do the rear as well. Otherwise, I guess it's just halfway done. Yeah, justification. This totally didn't spiral. There's a lot in each of these boxes, and there's a lot of decisions that were behind each and every one. So I figured the best place to start is probably the simplest. These are more aggressive brake pads by EBC, front and rear specific for the new brakes. And I've only heard good things about these pads, specifically their yellow stuff variant. So that's what I picked up. Next is a bit more unique. The most common way to increase the braking power in the rear of the car isn't actually to replace the caliper. It's actually just to space out the caliper so you can run a much larger rotor. caliper. You get a lot more stopping force that way. More on that later though. Since we're going to be reusing the calipers in the rear, however, I don't want them to look crusty considering what we're about to put on the front. So this is a fancy caliper restoration and color change kit, and like the pads, I've only heard good things about it. It looks pretty straightforward on the packaging, so I hope it's quick and easy. I guess we'll have to wait and see though. And the front brakes I went with are actually pretty cool. They're from a company called Rotorlab, and everything they do is custom. It's pretty common for people when they want to upgrade their S4 brakes to grind down different parts of the car, making changes that can't be reversed, all so that they can fit a used Brembo they sourced from a different platform. And the real downside to this is you've got to cut the car quite a bit. In other words, once upgraded, it'd be pretty hard to go back. That is not the case with these. Rather than machining the car to fit the brakes, this kit machines the brakes to fit the car. In other words, these calipers have been specifically rebuilt, modified, and powder coated to be a bolt-on upgrade to the S4. Super cool. And the caliper base is a 17Z Brembo, which is both a huge upgrade over what comes stock on this car and more than enough for anything I'm going to do with it. The car is going to be going from 2-piston front calipers to 6, and looks-wise, there's absolutely no comparison. And to match the custom calipers, the car is also getting custom rotors. That's another part that people like to modify in order to fit the B5, and similarly, Rotorlab makes custom versions of these as well. They're huge, drilled, and gorgeous. Plus, we've got a matching, larger than OEM custom set for the rear as well. And along with the new fluid and brake lines front and rear, I have a hunch this car's gonna stop quite a bit better. We've got a lot of work to do before that though, starting by getting access to all the brakes. With the car in the air, I could remove our 10mm spacers, and fingers crossed, these new brakes are thin enough we won't need them again. We won't know for a while though. And here's right about when I started to fixate. I had one thing exclusively on my mind: removing all the braking components from the front and rear of the car. And I figured the easiest place to start would be the front. Believe it or not, this starts no different than a typical brake job, starting by removing the electrical harness and then getting access to the pads by removing the retaining clip. And I think the one thing I'll miss about these calipers is just how easy it is to compress the piston. There's a little hole for a screwdriver, and with some pressure, the pads come right out. Switching pads is super simple, but then again, it's also quite easy on a Brembo. So it's not like we're going to be losing anything there. And from here, the next step is to unbolt the calipers themselves. And it's really as simple as one bolt up top and one on the bottom. These ones have a tendency to get extremely seized though. And the one thing I don't want is to snap one. Thankfully on the driver's side, everything came loose rather easily. So much so that I could pry down the caliper and free the rotor before undoing the bolt on the bottom. Gotta love it. And after this bolt, I've reached the point of no return, or at least the point where it becomes annoying to return because I have to rebleed the brakes. The only thing holding this caliper in place is this brake line right here, and removing it is the only way to get the caliper free. And after that, I left it to drain and moved on to the other side, which was an identical process, other than one key difference, an annoying one at that. For some reason, the top caliper bolt was horrendously seized, so much so that I went through both half a can of penetrating oil and half of my day. But eventually, after I kid you not hours of trying, the bolt started to move. I was really fearing another TT turbo situation there. Thankfully, that wasn't the case, and I could proceed as planned, though with quite a bit less time left in the day. And if removing the front brakes seemed easy, which other than that one bolt they were, the rear is even easier. These are super standard rear calipers, and the old double wrench technique removes the caliper from the caliper hanger. 2 pins, one on the top, one on the bottom, and then you can use pliers to remove the cable for the parking brake as well. But after that, the pads are free, and the only 2 bolts left are Allen bolts, which hold the caliper hanger and the rotor in place. And these were on the verge of being seized, making some very snappy noises. For some reason or another, I was convinced this would be a weekend job. Oh, how wrong I was. You see, even without wasting half a day on a stuck bolt, my hopeful dream of this being a 2-day swap, well, that was going to be ruined whether I wanted it to be or not. It was all in the fine print, since the very beginning. You see, the next step that I was about to start was refurbishing the rear brakes, and what I was about to learn is that's not exactly a quick task. You can't rush it. So how do I actually do this? Alright, looks like there's a couple steps. Clean the calipers, use their degreaser, 20 minutes and a metal prep. Okay, the first 3 steps are easy. Step 5, rust preventative coating. Each coat takes 2 to 5 hours to dry. Multiple are recommended. Wait, 2 to 5 hours and then 3 to 4 for the paint itself? There's no way this is getting done this weekend. Not to mention, what's listed on the box is generous. The cans in the kit list different drying times, and on those, each coat of paint takes 24 hours to dry. And of course, multiple are recommended for the best finish. In other words, plan ruined. Might as well get started though, and for parts as gross as this, I'm gonna use a wire wheel. Someday I hope to have a fancy pants sandblasting chamber, but at the moment, I do everything manually. Doesn't mean it's not going to turn out good though, it just means it's gonna take quite a bit longer than it would any other way. And my goal here isn't to make these perfect, I just kinda wanna clean the surface as best I can before putting their degreaser on it. And just like that stuck bolt, this was another part of the job that took way longer than I thought it would actually take. And I was slowly coming to terms with the fact that the timeline for this project may not be entirely within my control. At least with a lot of effort, it looks a little bit better. I know it doesn't have to be perfect, but it's hard not to want it to be. Comparison itself is difficult to avoid, but they also say that comparison is the thief of joy, so probably best to try and avoid it. Much easier said than done though. Look for progress rather than perfection, right? With yet another hour of the day gone, I was ready to actually start the caliper painting process. And the first step is using the industrial degreaser. And this does exactly what the name says. Helps remove all the dirt and grease so that when you're painting, you're not actually painting on anything that will come up. Plus, it makes them look a little bit better too. Once that's done and the pieces are completely dry, I could move on to the metal prep. And this is another chemical that helps with surface adhesion. Basically, all I had to do was coat everything and wait 20 to 30 minutes while it was wet to make sure that it was properly able to prepare the surface for the next treatment. And even though proper powder coating would make these perfect, I still have hope that we can get a really good finish with what we're doing now. After all, it definitely can't be worse than what it was. Plus, so far, it's been super satisfying. After a couple more touch-up coats, the time was up and everything was ready to be rinsed. I refilled the spray bottle with water and did my absolute best to get all of the metal prep off. And once everything's clean, I've got to wait yet again until everything is bone dry. Then we'll get to put what's going to act as our primer on there. Now, this isn't a typical primer, and this whole kit isn't your typical paint kit for calipers. It's from a brand that makes chemicals used to revert rust, and this primer, from what I could tell, is kind of their main product. Apparently, it helps stop rust from spreading, which is awesome. But my calipers aren't really rusty, so the part that I'm excited for is the fact that it's self-leveling. That's gonna go a long ways towards making the finished product look less like paint and more like a waxy finish. At least that's what they say. So I'm excited to see if it works. Sadly, we do have to do a couple coats of this, and from all the sources I looked at, each coat is going to take quite a while to dry. Anywhere from 6 hours to a whole day depending on the temperature. And sadly, given the current humidity, I'm probably going to be on the long end of that range. Since we have to wait, we might as well answer yet another unknown. Are the front brakes as bolt-on as they claim to be? And the bigger question, do they fit with the rotiforms? And I figure the only way to really figure that out was to loosely bolt on one side and see what type of clearance issues we were going to run into. The kit comes with everything we need to install the calipers onto the stock S4 uprights. The only issue we should run into is with this hardware. They chose a length of hardware that supports the majority of platforms they make these kits for. The issue is some of them require less than others. So at the very best, these bolts will fit perfectly, and they won't hit the rotor. And at the very worst, we're going to need to shorten them or run an extra washer. So planning that out was really one of the main reasons I wanted to do this test fit to begin with. And unfortunately, it looks like we're going to need to shave a couple millimeters off our hardware. Or just double the washer like I did here, and we'll have all the clearance we need. With an extra one of those, the rotor spins freely with no interference, which is an extremely good sign. Next is the part I was actually nervous about though. In a perfect world, these wheels will fit with no spacers. That would result in no poke and a flush fitment, so I'm hoping it's going to clear now. And the concerning part is it's close. Very close. Close to the point where I really don't think I'm going to actually be able to tell until the caliper is fully bolted on with pads. That way it's sitting where it actually needs to be. The good news is they clear the inner diameter. Baby steps, in other words. I took the wheel back off and put my head back there again to start planning out whether I wanted to add an additional washer or cut the hardware. Honestly, both ways would probably work. The kit recommends cutting the hardware, but I don't really want to ruin the threads themselves, so I might just look for a thicker washer. And given I still had to wait for the first coat of the primer, that's all I was able to get done that day. The next day, however, I immediately came back and put on the next coat. The surface was smooth and textured, so my goal with this second coat was to make it even smoother and less textured. I also wanted to cover all the areas I ended up missing last night. Today was really when the pace was starting to get to me. Like I was saying earlier, comparison is really tough to avoid. And I know there's a ton of people out there who have access to tools, powder, sandblasting, stuff that's not only faster, but objectively a better result. And sure, someday I'll have all of those. But it sucks wanting to make an improvement in the present and knowing you're not quite there yet. Knowing you're almost wasting time for an inferior result. Kind of a weird thing to think about. Like deep down you know it's going to be better than it was, but not quite as good as it could be, and done not nearly as fast. Why do I even think like this to begin with? Why does anybody think like this? I feel like no matter how much I do, it's never really enough. And maybe that's the whole root of the issue. Current culture's obsession with maximalism, the glorification of hyperproductivity, almost to a dangerous point. Call it hustle culture, call it whatever you want, doesn't make a difference. Constantly, every single day, hundreds of things vying for your oh-so-limited attention every second. Advertisements, obligations, diversions, you name it. And when something does grab your attention long enough that you do something about it, well, by the time it's done, you're late to the next thing, and you've missed 3 others. You feel underproductive because everyone out there seems to be overproductive. It's easy to fall into because everybody seems to be doing it. And because comparison is human nature, it's easy to feel like you have to do what everyone else is. But that's a fallacy in itself. Maybe most people glorifying it doesn't actually make it the best way to live. The next morning, the real fun could actually begin. Well, for at least an hour. It was time to put the first layer of actual paint on the brakes, and according to the can, this takes even longer than the primer to dry. And just as expected, multiple coats are recommended for the best finish. In other words, there goes the rest of my week. But at least now that these are the right color, I can start to see progress again. And at least to me, working towards progress is the best motivation out there. So I pressed on. I already know that these aren't going to be perfect. I mean, they're high mileage brakes after all. But I will say that coming into this, I was not expecting a mirror finish to the paint. So that's actually pretty cool. The following day, I was especially excited for. The brakes looked way better than I expected wet, but I had no idea how the paint was actually going to dry. And shockingly, the finish didn't change whatsoever. It was glossy, thick, shiny. Honestly, it was kind of weird. I was not expecting the finish to look nearly as good as it did after just one coat. And the instructions clearly say that it gets even better with 2 to 3. So I guess, in other words, for me, the next couple mornings are absolutely spoken for. I finished up today's coat and took off. There's no use beating around the bush. I'm in a situation where I'm forced to wait, and initially that made me anxious because I felt like I wasn't actually being productive. But I think I had it all wrong. Just because you're not actively working on something does not mean you're not actively making progress. Quite the opposite, actually. Maybe empty space or empty time holds just as much meaning as its positive counterpart. I mean, I was so focused on the fact I had to wait that I failed to see what was actually around me. There's a lot out there, and because I was so fixated, I wasn't seeing it. And as good as constantly being productive and constantly working is, it can almost lead to a sort of tunnel vision. You don't take the time to see the big picture or the world around you, and you definitely don't have time to try and make sense of it. All I'm getting at is this: I have to wait to make progress, and I will make that progress. But that doesn't mean I can't make use of this negative space, the extra time. Might as well enjoy it, learn something, and come back with a new perspective. I mean, at the end of the day, probably doesn't matter how fast you're going if you're heading towards nowhere. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, consider dropping a like and subscribing for more. That's the best way you can help support me and my content. Either way, I'll see you guys in the next episode. Thank you again. Have a wonderful day.